Gaza health authorities declare more than 5,000 killed in Israeli shelling and over 15,000 wounded.
EU foreign affairs ministers say they're mostly in favour of a humanitarian pause in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, but are avoiding calls for a ceasefire.
Sweden is one step closer to joining NATO as Turkey's president has submitted a protocol for Stockholm's admission into the alliance.
Iran tries to ease soaring tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan and warns against US and EU involvement in the region.
A constant stream of ambulances in Gaza's hospitals show the intensity of the Israeli army's bombardments in its war against Hamas. These attacks, in response to the worst terrorist attack in the history of Israel, have already caused more than 5,000 deaths on the Palestinian side, more than 2,000 of them children, according to Gaza's health authorities. While the number of wounded is more than 15,000, Israel is relentlessly hitting Hamas-related targets, even in areas where it has asked the Palestinian civilian population to seek refuge. A population that is barely surviving after 17 days of almost total siege as Palestinian militias continue to fire rockets against Israeli territory. The intensification of the bombings in the last few hours suggests that we are getting closer to the announced ground operation of the Israeli army against Hamas. The Tzahal has called up 360,000 reservists and has deployed a good part of them along the border with Gaza. Gaza's medical professionals are on the front line in the war between Israel and Hamas. On top of the relentless bombing, they have to cope with power cuts and severe shortages of medical supplies. One emergency room doctor told Euronews correspondent Nibal Hajo about his harrowing experiences.
كل يوم بيمر علينا حالات صعبة، كل يوم حالات أصعب من اللي قبله، أغلب الحالات للأسف يعني كانوا أطفال بالدرجة الأولى وبعدك بيجي نساء. بالنسبة للحالات يعني كلهم صعبة. طبيعة عمل أنا هنا في غرفة، أغلب عملي كان في غرفة العناية المكثفة هنا في التابعة للطوارئ. أغلب الحالات اللي بتيجي صراحة بيكون وضعها صعب على يعني قريبة من الموت، أغلبهم بيجي مع الأسف. أطفال بيبقوا مبتورين أطرافهم أو كل جسمهم مليان شظايا. للأسف اليوم ما فيش أي طاقة استيعابية. وصلنا لدرجة إنه نحن يعني نختار مين يعيش ومين يموت حسب درجة الحالة.
Medical staff also live in constant fear for their loved ones, who could be among the victims at any time.
الأوقات بآخر استجابة باقي الأجسام لو صار حدث صار قصف إشي ما بتأخر شوي، ممكن يتأخر شوي في بعض الأوقات نتيجة عدم التواصل أو القدرة على التواصل معهم. التوتر أكيد موجود، يعني أكيد الواحد بيكون متوتر وبخاف يكون في حدا من أهله موجود في القصف هذا. تمام، صارت بعض الأطباء لقوا أهليهم من ضمن الشهداء اللي جايين والجرحى. طبعا إن شاء الله هذا شعور لا يلا لا يكتبه حدا، أنت تكون رايح تستقبل حدا تلاقي أهلك من بينهم، شعور صعب جدا الصراحة.
Gaza's hospitals have had to deal with the consequences of airstrikes many times in the past, but they have never been so intense, nor without the hope of ending anytime soon.
EU foreign affairs ministers say they're mostly in favour of a humanitarian pause, but are avoiding calls for a ceasefire in the Middle East. With humanitarian aid slowly trickling into Gaza, ministers met Monday in Luxembourg to discuss the latest developments in the unfolding crisis between Israel and Hamas. But among them, the voices on what should be done are very different.
As a person who would be against a ceasefire. A ceasefire means no one gets killed that day. But we have to think about what the goals are. And for Israel, and I think for the Western world, the goal would be to go after Hamas, the terrorist organization which has been terrorizing Israel for very many years.
There is a terrorist organization controlling Gaza, sending rockets every day, perpetrated a barbarous attack on Israel territory. So the question is how such a ceasefire should be established. It needs to be established on both sides. since it's valid, and I hope that no one is not understanding that Israel has a right for self-defense.
The EU's official position refers to the right of Israel to self-defense while respecting international humanitarian law. But why isn't the EU calling for a ceasefire like the United Nations is? As this analyst says, it isn't necessarily a contradiction to support Israel's right to defend itself on one hand and on the other uphold international humanitarian law while protecting civilians.
A call for a ceasefire would essentially be telling the Israelis, stop. And there are a number of people, leaders within the EU, that don't agree with that. They would want to see Israel given the chance, given the opportunity to, as they put it, eradicate the extremist elements in Gaza. I don't think that they will. But nevertheless, that's another story. That's a military discussion to be had.
He also says a new peace process in the Middle East should once again be explored if any lasting resolution is to be found.
Iran has become the latest foreign power to try to ease soaring tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Tehran hosted a meeting of the country's foreign ministers, as well as those of Russia and Turkey, which both have a strong influence in the region. Hostility remains high following Azerbaijan's recapture of its Armenian-dominated Nagorno-Karabakh territory last month. Iran says it wants the encounter to be a cornerstone for improved relations. It also warns against U.S. and EU involvement in the South Caucasus.
Sweden is one step closer to joining NATO as Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has submitted a protocol for Stockholm's admission into the alliance to Turkey's parliament for ratification, a move that comes after months of pressure from NATO allies. Before this decision, Turkey and Hungary were the only NATO members not to endorse Sweden's membership. Erdogan had been delaying ratification of Sweden's membership, accusing Stockholm of being too soft on Kurdish militants and other groups his country considers to be security threats. Turkey was also angered by a series of protests where the Quran was burnt in Sweden. Turkey lifted its opposition after US President Joe Biden's administration signaled it would let Turkey buy 40 new F-16 fighter jets and modernization kits from the United States. Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Russian forces are funneling additional forces to the Avdiivka front, despite ongoing challenges with the frontal mechanized assaults and the failure of a renewed push over the past few days, says the Institute for the Study of War. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian defensive fortifications, including minefields, pose a significant challenge to Russian advances around Avdiivka. Avdiivka, with the pre-war population of around 32,000 people, has been a symbol of Ukrainian resistance since Russia's invasion in 2014. The frontline city, which is widely viewed as a gateway to recapturing the Russian-occupied city of Donetsk, which is about 20 kilometers away, was briefly seized by Russia in 2014, but was later retaken by Ukrainian forces, who in the next years have built solid fortifications here. Ukrainian sources stated that Russian forces continued to transfer personnel to the Avdiivka direction to support offensive efforts despite heavy losses. The UK Defence Ministry says recent Russian assaults in Avdiivka have contributed to a 90% increase in Russian casualties recorded by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence. It is likely that Russia has suffered up to 190,000 permanent casualties, killed and permanently wounded since the full-scale invasion began, with the total figure, including temporarily wounded, recovered and due to return to the battlefield, of up to 290,000. And this does not include Wagner Group or the prisoner battalion who fought in Bakhmut.
The number of Ukrainians who believe that the West is getting tired of the war raging on in their country has spiked. According to an October poll conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, 30% of Ukrainians believe that the West's support has weakened. That's up from 15% in September 2022. This so-called war fatigue is one of the Kremlin's main propaganda narratives. However, the majority of Ukrainians believe that Western support is strong and is unlikely to weaken in the coming months. According to some, the EU is ready to continue providing assistance to Kyiv.
Well, of course, President Putin would like to say this, and he wants to inject a kind of sense of hesitation, or rather a sense of tiredness inside the European Union towards Ukraine. But I'm not so sure, sitting here in Berlin, that the fatigue is deep-rooted enough, that it's wide enough. But the sense that the war has gone on long enough is out there among the member states, but it's not deep enough and wide enough to actually say, to come to the point where the Europeans say enough is enough, let's negotiate.
It's so important to have a good understanding of what's at stake in the conflict, which isn't just the future security order of Europe and the potential for more Russian aggression, but is also around the economic and political systems that Ukrainians are fighting for the reform of and fighting to join together with their European neighbors. This is a conflict worth supporting Ukraine in, because the alternative in which Putin wins and destroys that country will lead not only to a shattering of the European security paradigm, but the political and economic paradigm across Europe as well.
In early October, representatives of the EU member states visited Kyiv for the first ever summit of EU foreign ministers outside the bloc, an act read as a sign of solidarity and support for Ukraine.